Hello, Star Trek fans. Welcome to ReBinge It. This is the ReBinge Star Trek Voyager podcast. My name is Kim.
And my name is James.
And we're watching Star Trek Voyager from the beginning, one episode at a time. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are on Season 1, Episode 6, The Cloud. This episode aired February 13th, 1995. Before we talk about this one, anything to say about last week's episode, Phage?
No, it was perfect, even if the episode wasn't terribly good. I did, however, really like the makeup on the guys with the phage. The way it looked like there was bits of people stuck all over them. That was really nicely done.
I don't know. I really liked that episode. It definitely had some problems, but I enjoyed it. I thought you said after you watched this one, you felt like maybe you were a little bit hard on the phage.
Yeah, it might be going up to maybe just a little bit of a thumbs up there. Maybe I was a little harsh.
Well, that's okay.
This episode kind of puts it into perspective.
Yeah, not to be a spoiler, but not as good.
Spoiler alert.
Maybe the first questionable episode in Season 1. Well, you have the notes this week.
Yes, I do.
And by the way, this is our second time recording because the first recording failed.
Yes.
So if we seem a little crabby...
There was a... If we're a little crabby, it's not just the episode. We were having technical issues this morning.
Honestly, it's our own fault. We're engineers. How did we not have a backup going?
I know, right? It's almost embarrassing.
It's embarrassing. Yeah. Don't tell anyone.
How could we know a plasma conduit was going to rupture?
Oh, geez. How could we know we were going to hit that black hole that would disrupt our devices?
I'm going with that. There was a quantum singularity, some kind of.
Threw
everything off.
Some kind of tachyon particles.
Oh, definitely.
Or what are the other time travel ones?
Oh, chronoton particles.
Chronoton, yep. It was definitely some particles.
Yeah.
That got us here.
Some kind of. Well, we open with Janeway recording a personal log. And would you like me to read the star date of that, Kim?
Not really. I'm good. I already told you it was February 13th, 1995.
Okay. Janeway is lamenting that they are the entire family of man. Well, for a start, there are also women there. So wouldn't humanity be a better description? Plus, there are also non-humans on Voyager. I'm pretty sure I've seen a Vulcan, a Klingon, and a Bajoran. So isn't this a case of really we're the only Starfleet out here?
Yeah, I feel like she could have just said, we're all alone out here. We don't know anybody else. And that would have covered it. But, yeah.
And thus begins my complaining about this episode.
Uh-oh.
She is basically worried that she and the crew are feeling alone, and she needs to find a way to be more than just a captain. But she's not sure how to do that. Perhaps this is where leadership needs to come into it. She's actually recognizing she needs to be the person to lead rather than just in command. She goes on to talk about how Starfleet teaches a captain that they should maintain a certain distance from her crew, and how she's always felt comfortable with that.
But it's so weird because we established right away in episode 1 that she wasn't necessarily comfortable with that distance.
That's
and that
true.
She liked to get to know the crew.
Yeah.
I felt like they were trying to make her a different captain from Picard, right? Because they certainly really leaned into that with Picard. That was part of that character.
Right.
But I thought we were showing a different Janeway out of the gate, but now we've sort of reeled that back a bit. It feels out of place with the previous episodes.
Well, she was worried when Harry was kidnapped and missing about her not having any kind of link to him.
Right.
So
it just seemed strange.
Right.
I would say a couple of things.
Yeah, go for it.
First, this comes from a very 90s and earlier old school form of leadership and management, really. Leadership was a different thing, where you can't get too close to people if they report to you, right? That's just a really old school way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And there are still people who think that. I mean, I've had training that has told me that, but I just think that's BS. The best way to get the most out of people is to get to know them as humans or whatever species they are, and to let them get to know you, because that's how you build bonds. That's how you build loyalty.
Agreed.
And I actually think that is maybe the most critical part of leadership. So I think that's just a really old school way of looking at things. Yeah. And I also thought they were trying to show us that Janeway felt differently about it. What I would say about this little speech that she makes is I get why they're doing it. where they're trying to show us that now she doesn't quite know what to do because she's never been in this situation before. She hasn't trained for this exact situation before. And now she's uncomfortable. But I think it would have been better if they had shown us that rather than told us in this way. So it's just it's like it's an important thing that's happening, but it's sort of awkward.
Yeah. Perhaps the problem is Starfleet trains captains just to command and not to be in leadership.
Well, I'm going to say yes. I think that's absolutely true. Part of it is because the people who wrote this didn't know anything about leadership. That's one thing. But when we look at our good leaders, our great leaders in all the captains that we've had, they've all been great leaders.
Yeah.
I mean, I leave Archer out because I never watched it, so I don't know anything about him.
Was he a captain?
But the other captains that we know, they're good leaders. But whenever we see another admiral or another captain, they're total jerks.
Oh,
and so we can only assume that that's the norm and that the ones that we're watching the shows about, those are the exceptions.
Right. It was almost every time Cisco, for example, interacted with an admiral, they were a complete jerk.
And what's so funny about it is if you're going to be focused on command, that would make more sense if you were a military operation, but Starfleet isn't.
Right.
So it would make more sense to focus on leadership, because especially with someone like Picard, and they've got these ships full of civilians. It's like, you got to be more than a commander, right? You have to be a leader.
Well, the more I look at Picard in TNG, the more I think about Picard is a 18th, 19th century British naval captain, part of the aristocracy, distant from the crew. Social barriers were everything. He has such a vibe of that.
Well, in one of those documentaries, the many documentaries I've watched about Star Trek, I know Patrick Stewart talked about Gene Roddenberry giving him a book, Horatio Hornblower, and saying, you want to know the backstory of Picard? There it is. So, that tells you a lot.
That would make a lot of sense. Back to the episode. Janeway is walking around the ship and describes it as a stroll. And it's kind of funny because she goes into engineering, and B'Elanna basically treats it like a captain's inspection.
Status report.
Yeah. And Janeway even tells her, it's just a stroll.
I really endorse this idea of strolling through the different departments, especially when you're in an unsure situation. Because if she just sort of walks through the different departments, that'll become the norm, rather than people scrambling to give her a formal status report or think that she's there for some formal reason. This is really how she could form some easy bonds with people, by just making it normal for her to just turn up. And then they just start having lighthearted conversations, and the interaction becomes normal, and she will learn about what's going on in these different departments, even when it's not necessarily something that needs to go to her. But if it becomes the norm to talk to the captain about something, now they're going to be better about delivering bad news or things that aren't going well. And that would really help her as a leader. I think it would be super valuable for this to become her norm.
One thing that springs to mind here is they're in extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps extraordinary methods of management or of leadership need to come into play.
Maybe not extraordinary, but different. Because I think this is perfectly legit.
I wonder if some of this as well is because you talk about the 90s management style, and I see the old management style as a distant management who you only interact with when it's the weekly meeting and they find out things are problems and they get annoyed. Whereas if you have this more agile style, and I mean that in terms of the actual word, not the methodology, you're finding out things you should know about the moment they're happening, and you can react.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, they should be doing daily stand-ups anyway, but yes, I think it's really important for her to be agile, and not agile with a capital A, but to be agile in any situation, because again, this is all new to them. They have to figure out how to deal with it. There's nothing in the book about it, so they're writing the book about it now.
Janeway continues her log, saying that perhaps the distance is necessary. Perhaps she needs to be a captain that is larger than life, and adds, I only wish I were larger than life, and then tells the computer to delete that last part. I kind of like that. I don't ever remember Janeway questioning herself.
At first, when I heard her say that, I was like, oh, again, out of character. But then I thought, no, everybody has imposter syndrome. And that's really, that could be what this is. She just had this moment of, do I belong here? Do I really know what to do to be in charge? I mean, any leader, manager, human who doesn't have imposter syndrome ever, I mean, I question whether or not there's something wrong with you. I think imposter syndrome is more the norm. So it does make sense that she would say that, especially in this situation where she's not trained for it, because nobody could be. And she's also had to mix in the other crew with her crew, and a bunch of really terrible things happened, and now she might never get anybody home. So it would make sense that you'd be like, well, I'm not sure I'm prepared for this.
What am I doing here?
Mm-hmm.
Janeway now heads into the mess and clearly makes Harry and Tom a little uncomfortable at their breakfast. It's quite awkward as she doesn't quite seem to know how to be less formal and engage in small talk with the crew.
Yeah, it's like she doesn't even quite know where to look, and
Right.
Harry doesn't know where to look, and they don't know what to say, and everybody's just uncomfortable.
Kate Mulgrew played that really well.
She did.
You could feel the uncomfortableness, the sort of the awkwardness.
Yeah.
When Janeway leaves, Harry thinks they should have invited her to join them. But Tom tells him, ensigns don't do that. Captains don't want courtesy, they want respect. And that's why you don't get chummy with the lower ranks. If a captain wants their company, she'll ask them to join her. Harry, I feel being the smart one here, tells Tom he's working from an old rulebook. I really kind of liked that with Harry.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Harry was trying to break down those barriers, again, in an extraordinary situation.
Well, he's being empathetic.
Yeah.
It's really quite sweet what he says, because when Tom says the thing about she doesn't fraternize with the lower ranks, he's like,
Yeah.
well, then she's got nobody to talk to because there aren't any other captains or admirals out here. So who is she supposed to talk to? And
Yeah,
I thought,
true.
Wow, how empathetic. I do think some of the stuff that Tom says and does doesn't necessarily fit with the character they're trying to build. Sometimes it's almost like out of sync. But
Yeah.
I think in this situation, he's maybe repeating something he's learned from his father, because it sounds like this was the kind of leader that he was.
Oh, yes. Remember earlier where he said about his father would deliver lectures?
Yeah.
He's parroting things that he's been lectured to parrot back at his dad.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we're all familiar with parental style of lecturing.
Right. Now we discover what the real emergency on the ship is. They've run out of coffee. That's it. Engage self-destruct. We're done. It's over, people.
Well, in the pandemic, when our coffee maker broke, that was the worst thing that happened.
Oh, yeah.
All the other appliances, right? The dishwasher broke, the washing machine broke, even the refrigerator. All these things went wrong in the pandemic, but the only thing that I fell apart when we lost was the coffee maker.
That was a bad one.
That was bad. And now we have two. So I understand exactly what she's saying.
There's now a strange interaction between Janeway and Neelix, where he starts off complimenting her, and then he basically lectures her on not using her replicator rations for coffee, saying it shows an example to the crew to use the natural alternatives. However, his even better than coffee substitute appears to be a brown kind of sludge. Fortunately, Chakotay calls Janeway to the bridge before she even attempts this so-called coffee, and she heads out.
I have many things to say about this scene.
Well, before you do, I'm just going to say Neelix's outfit in this scene with the weird chef's hat, the apron or whatever he's wearing, it's a truly bizarre setup.
Yes.
And that would make a great cosplay if it was for any other character than Neelix.
Yeah, I don't want to dress up like Neelix. This is the beginning of some very bad things that come from Neelix in this episode. It starts with him complimenting her on her lipstick. And I'm sorry, 300 years in the future, a woman who has risen in the ranks to captain.
Yeah.
And do you really think she's carrying lipstick? The fact that we just think this is like every other woman that we've tried to write but didn't know anything about is ridiculous.
Yeah.
That really annoyed me. She's not wearing lipstick. The only reason she has lipstick on in this scene is because she's an actress in a television show. So A, that was where we started and it was dumb. But then B, when he starts kind of preaching at her, I was so annoyed because I was thinking back to what happened in the last episode where he was just stealing stuff from around the ship without anybody's permission, just doing whatever the hell he wanted. And then they went on that mission and he insisted that he go along, and then he didn't listen to Chakotay, who was the lead of the mission, and he nearly got himself killed. And here he stands lecturing the captain about what she's doing looks bad.
Yeah.
I don't think that the message is necessarily bad. I think it's a legitimate conversation to have, but I think it's completely incorrect to have it sort of out in the open and to be preaching at her about it.
It did seem very preachy.
It just really annoyed me. He comes off so bad in this episode, and this is just the beginning. But the best part of the scene is we get a couple of Janeway maneuvers in this scene, because while he's doing the preachy thing, she doesn't scream and yell at him or lose her mind, but she does the look.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I am going to throw you out of the airlock, right? She's got this great look on her face.
She's just keeping it under control.
She is, because she just goes, fine. And then when he goes to dump the clumpy stuff into her cup and it comes out just like goop, look on her face is absolutely priceless.
I do think it's a valid private conversation that there seems to be some resistance, and we see it in this episode, some resistance to the crew eating Neelix's food.
Yeah, well, it's probably disgusting.
I'll comment on that.
Well, you don't get any choice is the problem, right?
Yeah.
They're used to just ordering whatever they want from the replicator,
Right.
and now they have to just eat what's in front of them, like
Exactly.
all of us did when we were children.
And I think that comes down, we talk about leadership, of Janeway maybe explaining to the crew, we don't have the luxury of the things we're used to.
But I also think someone needs to explain to Neelix
Yeah.
that you also can't just do whatever the hell you want. You're now a part of this crew and you have to be a good example too. And nobody has done that. Did anybody talk to him after what he did last week? That was entirely his fault.
I feel there's been a lack of briefings of Neelix.
Aye.
And there was complaints about the marquee crew members. It's like, has anybody noticed Neelix?
Yeah, could we deal with this guy? Anyway, so yeah, that annoyed me.
Off to the bridge, and they've discovered a nebula containing high levels of Omicron particles, which they could use to boost their antimatter reserves. Janeway orders them to set course, and we get one of the classic lines from Voyager. As Janeway says, "There's coffee in that nebula."
Iconic.
And we go into the opening credits. Well, I feel I need to be honest here and say the best part of the episode is now over.
Oh, I understand what you're saying, but I think there's one other thing yet to come.
I have a suggestion for Janeway. She could try tea.
No, it's hard to go cold turkey on coffee. I mean, she could maybe slowly get to it, but
Yeah.
It's hard to just give it up and start on something else. I feel her pain.
What was the Ted Lasso line? How do you take your tea? Back to the counter.
Back to the counter because there's been some horrible mistake. I thought when they showed the nebula, at least when I watched it the second time, it sort of looked like a face. Did you notice that?
I did not.
It reminded me of that episode of TNG where there was that big face in space. Do you remember that?
I don't recall that one. That might not have been on your watch this one list.
Probably wasn't. I don't remember it being good. I think that face in space was called Nagilum.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of the episode that it was from, but that's what it reminded me of here.
I'm going to have to go and do some homework now and look that up. In the captain's chair, Janeway tells Chakotay she's concerned about crew morale, and he likens it to a period of mourning. And here we learn they did not bring a counselor along with them, as she says the mission didn't require it.
And the 90s. The 90s didn't require it.
I feel every vessel should probably have a counselor. I think it should just be a part of the standard complement. I mean, you're away from home.
Yeah.
Some members of the crew, it may be their first deployment or their first mission, which would potentially be stressful. Plus, we've seen people get killed in accidents on ships.
Taken over by aliens.
Right. So in a more evolved future, mental health of your crew should be a priority. Although, let's be honest, if they had a counselor, it probably just would have been one more of the casualties in the first episode.
Well, probably. I agree, though. There should be a counselor on every ship. It would just make sense.
Right. Maybe there was a scenario, and I wish they'd found some way of doing this. After Deep Space Nine ended, getting Ezri onto Voyager.
Well, if they could get Ezri onto Voyager, then why couldn't they get everybody home?
Well, okay. We have the prophets do it, because we know how fickle they are.
Oh.
Ezri, we've decided you would be useful here.
Except she doesn't come along for a few years yet.
Yeah, that's true.
I think maybe you're just having a little bit of a dream there. I don't think that's happening.
Hey, it's what I do. They now arrive at the nebula, and the scans show nothing to be worried about. And regular viewers will know that's a red flag if ever there was one.
Yeah, Harry says something like, "Oh, our shields can handle it." And you're like, "Oh, no, they can't. Oh, dear."
They start flying into the nebula, and we get some very hokey 90s VFX, which seems to be like a pink mist on the view screen.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry comments he's never seen anything like it. Tuvok, acting in probably the snottiest scene in all of Star Trek, calls Harry, telling him that that's a comment we prefer not to hear from senior bridge officers. That seemed very petty, especially as we see what Vulcans do when this kind of thing happens. They just look at it and say, fascinating.
Fascinating. Yeah, this whole scene was weird. We've never seen anybody do that before, where they're on the bridge with other people and they use the communicator to call somebody and then they kind of whisper. We have never seen that happen before. I question whether or not that would actually work. I always tell people, if you're going to give feedback to your employees, it's good to do it quickly.
Yeah.
so that they know, or at least they understand the context of the situation. And it's not something you're just telling them later and they're like, why didn't you just tell me right away?
Yeah.
I do think that quick feedback can be a good thing, but the way you deliver it is important.
Oh, yes, yes.
And he is just like, you shouldn't have said that. Like you said, he's a little bit snotty about it. I don't think he's wrong, but really what he wants to tell Harry is you should just deliver that message a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Don't have the sort of awe and wonder, because that's what maybe shows, oh, you're unprepared. Instead, be a bit more stoic. That's what I think he wanted to tell him, but he didn't deliver the news well.
As they continue flying into the nebula, its density starts increasing, and a sudden jolt brings them to a dead stop. Tuvok reports they've encountered an energy barrier. There's another red flag.
Yeah.
They can't beam the Omicron particles on board, so Janeway just orders they push through the barrier.
Oh my God. And Janeway's like, punch it. Come on. Janeway can really be out of control in these first couple of episodes.
Once through, we see on the view screen yet more dodgy 90s VFX of these like little blue things on screen and a couple of green dots. When Janeway asks Tuvok what he makes of it, he responds with, I am unable to offer an identification. This results in Harry calling Tuvok saying, in other words, you've never seen anything like it. Delivering a bit of a burn to the Vulcan.
Delivering burn to senior officers on the bridge while on duty is a terrible idea. Like when you said that what Tuvok did was one of the snottiest things we've seen, I think, yeah, maybe that's true until this happened. This was so much more childish and so much snottier.
Harry upped it by
Somebody
one.
Absolutely needs to chat with Harry about that.
As much as I love them, I think Vulcans would be a nightmare to work with because they'd be like this all the time. You know, maybe Harry should be trained about how you work with Vulcans because they have no emotion. They wouldn't necessarily see that as a ding of Tuvok saying that. We've seen how, I think in Strange New Worlds, we saw some great interactions between Spock and his betrothed about how they just talk normally.
Right.
So a Vulcan saying something like that, another Vulcan's reaction would be, thank you for that excellent advice. I had not considered that before. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
So it would be very emotionless.
We used to get a lot of emails when we were doing the Deep Space Nine podcast about Bashir and the way that he would sort of not have empathy for other people and couldn't understand the emotions of others. And people would say that they felt like he represented a person on the spectrum.
Yeah.
I think you could probably look at this in a similar way. And I believe I've been in conversations as well where people talk about that being sort of like Spock.
Yeah.
And Spock was half human, but this guy, he's full on Vulcan.
Right.
So you would have to have some sort of training for others to realize, hey, this is how Vulcans are.
Yeah.
You have to learn to be able to cope with that as a human. You can't overreact to it. Otherwise, you fall down this sort of dangerous path.
Yeah.
So you would hope there's some sort of training and discussions about it. It's not that someone also shouldn't be telling Tuvok, hey, you have to adapt to deal with humans as well.
Yeah.
But everybody's got to learn how to work with each other in this kind of a situation. I think we talked about this before, where all these different cultures coming together, it really would never work. It would be total chaos.
Yeah, you'd have to be very careful. Because isn't it Tellarites? They're just naturally rude to everyone and each other.
Oh, like Dr. What was his name?
Noam
on Prodigy. Yeah, he was a nightmare.
So mark that one up for training.
Both sides need training.
Yeah. So they're through the barrier, but Tom reports the hole they made has just closed behind them.
Now you're stuck.
I feel this is their own fault.
Yeah. I have some questions about Janeway's decisions in this episode.
In the galley, Neelix is whining about flying into a nebula because he always goes around them. Kes explains how Starfleet are natural-born explorers, to which Neelix describes as natural-born idiots. He continues whining about how they have an amazing ship, but keep trying to find space anomalies that might rip it apart. Oh, that's actually a definition of Starfleet, pretty much.
Well, Kes gets it. They're explorers. That's what they do. That's what they're trained to do. It's part of the mission.
Kes describes it as wonderful, saying she'd peek inside every crack in the universe if she could.
And he's just being a jerk.
And I feel this is because she's not a petulant child like Neelix.
Yes, that was such a great line. And then she, yet again, even though she's supposedly more childlike, she's the one who's the adult in this situation.
Right.
Yeah.
She kisses Neelix, saying she's never kissed anyone inside a nebula before.
Oy.
I get this totally weird vibe of just a massively age mismatched relationship here.
Mm-hmm. And there's no chemistry between them.
Oh, God, no.
It feels wrong. It's weird. I don't know. There's just something wrong with the whole scene where he's just ranting and she kisses him to distract him. And the whole thing is weird.
Yes, it's unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the galley is interrupted by Voyager starting to shake as the ship starts being bombarded by what Tuvok describes as a non-reactive material that our sensors do not recognize. And worse, it's just passing straight through their shields.
Yeah.
We do get some more very dodgy visual effects of these blue blobs that look like molecules floating around in space.
And we never show an outside shot of the blue thing sticking to the ship, which is like, come on.
B'Elanna reports that these things are sticking to the hull, and worse, they're draining their energy reserves.
Mm-hmm.
Janeway orders reverse, but now they can't penetrate the barrier.
Of course.
They try phasers to no effect, and Chakotay suggests using a photon torpedo. It works, and they blow a hole in the barrier. After passing through more pink and purple clouds, they break free. Once outside, Janeway orders an analysis of the material on the hull, and we get another great Janeway line saying, "I'd like to know what it was that humbled every defense system on this ship."
Yeah.
Harry reports that this misplaced adventure cost them 11% of their energy reserves.
Whoops.
And a disappointed Janeway says, "I'm just going to have to give up coffee."
Oh.
We now go to a sleeping Harry, and Tom breaks into his quarters to wake him up and show him his holo program. There's a little aside about how in Starfleet Academy, Harry had to wear eye shades because his roommate was abusing stimulants and never slept. I added the stimulants part, but that's what I was thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
I still get this vibe that Starfleet Academy is this very cliquey private boarding school with like people walking around with tennis rackets and sweaters tied around the neck of their polo shirts, while they actually talk about polo and skiing at their dad's lodge in Aspen. And Tom is an example of how I also think it's loaded with Nepo kids.
Well, they certainly work pretty hard to give us that impression.
Yeah. Maybe it's the writers. Oh, this is like the boarding school my kids go to.
I'm not sure writers were making that much money.
Oh, maybe it's like the school that they'd like their kids to go to.
Maybe.
I just have this almost elitist feel about Starfleet Academy.
Right.
That it's churning out people who are sort of like, oh, you know, I'm better than you.
Well, remember Red Squad?
Oh, yeah. Oh, the Starfleet youth. Yeah.
That was a good example of it, yeah.
Right. Getting back to the show, and Tom's recreated a place called Chez Sandrine, a dive bar in Marseille. There's a pool table and various other characters, and one who looks like the archetype of a 1950s pool shark. Tom's also programmed a couple of women who basically fawn over him, and at the end of the scene, Tom describes it as a little piece of Earth in the Delta Quadrant. And Harry calls him out, saying, "You make the rest of us think you're shrugging it off," but Tom also misses home. I like that from Harry.
Yeah, Harry's the innocent.
First of all, this place never actually existed. This is just where Tom would have liked to have hung out.
Yeah, I don't think this place existed.
And I'm getting such a Reginald Barclay vibe from Tom here.
Oh.
He's created this fantasy world for himself. If you're doing that, why wouldn't you put an anime cat lady in there? I'm very disappointed, Tom. At least a Cation. That would be cool.
Well, I agree with you that I don't think this place really existed, and it would have made sense if they'd had some other characters in there. Cation would have been funny, but they didn't have the ability to do that well.
That's true.
In the same way we've talked about, they're not really sure what they're doing with Neelix. I don't think they know what they're doing with Tom yet either. Yeah. It's like they keep trying to make him this sort of rogue.
Yeah.
But then the way he behaves with Harry and the way he even behaves with Janeway, it doesn't make any sense. So they still haven't quite figured him out. And even when he's in this scene, he's programmed a woman to be hanging all over him. And it's like, even that, he seems uncomfortable. It doesn't really seem like it's what he wants. So I don't think they've got him figured out yet either. At the very least, I would say this is the kind of thing on Deep Space Nine that would have happened in Quarks. Whereas here, it's happening in the holodeck. It's away from the crew, and he just brought Harry with him. You know what I mean? So it's at least not something that's happening in the place of work of everybody else.
Yeah.
So I do feel like they're trying to be a little bit different, but I stand by Tom is all over the place. He just doesn't make sense yet.
My notes on this basically mirror yours. They're trying to give Tom this devil-may-care, swashbuckling rogue who all the ladies swoon over.
He's terrible at that.
But I'm getting Lieutenant Barclay, except with good hair. Shout out to Dwight Schultz. Love you, man.
Well, I don't think he's quite as awkward as Barkley, because Barkley, they made him unbelievably awkward with people and a true introvert. He couldn't even talk to people. Right. Tom doesn't have that. Tom does have at least a sort of smooth quality when he's just interacting with people normally. But I get what you mean.
I'll add that I do like how Robert Duncan McNeil is actually playing this character. I think with this sort of fumbling their way along with the writing, a less talented actor could have absolutely crashed and burned. And I think he's still managing to do a pretty good job.
Like Alexander Siddig, you mean? Okay.
Oh, dear.
I would add that while Tom is sort of confusing, I do really like some of the things they do with Harry, even though they made him earlier sort of be snotty back to Tuvok, but that's just maybe a young person's reaction. But like in the scene where he tells Tom he thinks he really does miss home. Yeah. But then he does this really funny thing at the end where he's like, oh, I don't like to drink too late. Like it upsets my stomach. It's like, oh my God, he's so cute. Yeah. It's very funny.
Harry seems to have a wisdom beyond his experience. Like you say, he seems to be more empathetic. He seems to have a natural ease about him.
I think it comes from having a solid family base, at least in the way they're writing the character, because he clearly has a solid family base. He knows who he is. Yeah. He sort of believes in himself, but he's also just really a sweet kid.
Off to engineering, and B'Elanna is analyzing the material they collected and enlists the Doctor's help. She and the Doctor are wonderfully combative.
Oh, yeah.
He's poking at her and she's poking right back. She just doesn't take any guff from him like the others seem to.
If he wasn't a hologram, she'd punch him.
And there's a great line from the Doctor when she comments about his lousy attitude. Mm-hmm. And he says, if you don't like my lousy attitude, you can write to a man at the Jupiter Station Holoprogramming Center. His name is Zimmerman. He looks like me.
Yes. We met Zimmerman on Deep Space Nine.
Oh, it so made me laugh because it reminded me of that joke about, the remotest island on Earth. And that's where the person who cares lives. I thought it was very funny and sarcastic coming from the hologram.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, there's a fair amount of technobabble here, and the Doctor gets in another dig at B'Elanna, and he suspects that what they have in the sample is far more interesting than B'Elanna's idea. Back to Janeway, and Chakotay has brought his medicine bundle to demonstrate a vision quest to her. And again, I'll advise people to read up on the concepts of a sacred bundle and Native American spiritual beliefs.
Yeah, it's so hard to know, as we said earlier, which of these things that we talk about with Native Americans are real and which ones are just coming from the charlatan advisor that they hired. So, I agree. If you want to learn about this, don't learn about this from Star Trek Voyager. Find a credible source of information.
Fortunately, B'Elanna interrupts them and gives them the bad news. This nebula may not be a nebula at all. And we go into a very dramatic ad break. On the bridge, Janeway and B'Elanna, along with the Doctor, are trying to determine if they did any serious harm to this life form.
Oh, the look on Janeway's face when she realizes it's a life form is really good.
And the Doctor describes how you ran your ship through it, fired phasers at it, and blew a hole in it with a photon torpedo, but is cut short as Janeway has had enough and mutes the audio.
Yes.
Too funny. The news isn't good, as it appears they have severely injured an innocent life form. This leads to a great comedic moment with the Doctor waving in the background.
Waving his hands,
trying to get their attention.
They treat the Doctor like we treat Siri and Alexa. Yes. Because really, that's what he is to them.
Right. We also get a quick Janeway maneuver here when she seems to just roll her eyes at his sarcasm.
Yes, she does.
This was interesting because the Doctor seems to know how to help this life form regenerate from the injury. But he sort of prompts B'Elanna to come up with the correct course of action.
Yeah.
And he seems really pleased with her coming to the correct results, even saying bravo at the end and smiling.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that comes from.
Exactly. I feel this is the first real pointer. Maybe there's something different with the Doctor, that maybe something's happening. He's not just the program, the medical supplement anymore, that something's happening.
Maybe he has learned that the more he is able to teach the crew, the less he will be relied on.
So his program's starting to expand.
Maybe.
So now they have a plan and Janeway jumps into action, giving orders to the bridge. They're returning to the nebula.
There's never been a more captain of action.
No.
She is just do it constantly.
Oh, so true.
Maybe we should talk about it a little bit more. No. Go. Now comes the best scene.
Back to Neelix, and he's pretty upset about going back into the nebula. Even describes it as a monster at one point. So he goes to see Janeway, And this goes about as well as you would expect for a whiny baby. He wants to leave and wait on his vessel until this is over. But Janeway pretty much tells him to go to hell, and they're busy, and after this is over, he can leave. In the meantime, he should just buckle up. And we get another great line from this episode where Janeway explains that dismissed is Starfleet for get out. She also gives him this great glancing look, a total Janeway maneuver.
This is my favorite scene in the episode. She says, just like Jonah and the whale, you're going in.
Yes.
Dismissed. I mean, it's very good. And the reason I got so annoyed with the scene way back at the beginning is she just sort of took the nonsense from him and just let it go. Whereas here, it's a private conversation.
Yep.
We're under duress. And now it's just like, no, you're not. You're acting like a child. And we're not going to stop everything just to set you aside.
Right.
Every time something dangerous happens, if you don't want to be on this ship, you don't have to be. This is my ship. Shut up and get out.
Bye-bye, Neelix.
And I just thought that was the speech he needed earlier, and I'm glad he finally got it.
He was a little deserving, yes.
He was, yeah.
So we go back to the hokey visual effects of Voyager flying through pink mist. We reach the hole, or wound that they created, but they start getting hit by multipolar energy charges, which look like a lightning storm around them, and they're losing shields. They lose inertial dampeners, and Tom loses control of the ship. There's a lot of shaking, and there's even someone falling from the upper levels of engineering.
Oh, yeah. That was bad.
Janeway tells B'Elanna to shut down the engines.
And they have to vent something, right? So they're losing more resources.
Yep.
This is a disaster of an episode.
Yes, it's really not going well.
No, it's terrible.
And I did like the use here of lighting on the bridge. TNG was always lit with the slider on maximum. But here, we actually get dark bridge scenes that really, I think, add to the atmosphere. It's such a good look.
When something important has happened, you should dim the lights. It's very important.
Right.
There's some funny stuff that's going on with Harry while all this is going on, because Harry does something good, then he misses something. Yeah. I think you said something to me at one point that you thought Neelix was like Wesley, but I think Harry is more like the Wesley character, but much less irritating, at least at this point. I liked Wesley. You really didn't, but I was fine with Wesley Crusher. He just seemed like a snotty kid.
Chakotay has noticed that what they thought were random eddies in the nebula are actually a circulatory system. Tom suggests they can surf back to the site of the damage through them. Janeway orders drift thrusters only, and they set off, very slowly.
But after, again, 1 second of analysis. Oh yeah, let's do that.
Hey, she is making all the calls. Neelix and Kes now come to the bridge with refreshments. And at this point, do you think Janeway is asking Tuvok, can we get a code on the door? Can we get one of those code pads?
Yeah. Please beam him back to his quarters and lock the door.
Well, you know, the only problem is the passcode would be 1234.
I mean, food is not allowed on the bridge. What are you doing? We can't be getting that stuff into the console.
No, food's not allowed in engineering. It's in the manual.
Although, remember, there were times in Deep Space Nine where they're walking around with cups on the bridge.
Was it the bridge or Ops?
I think it was both. You'd see the food in Ops, but I think on the Defiant, it just seems like, yeah, they had both.
You couldn't deny Jadzia her act Gino.
Yeah, exactly. And when Neelix comes in, because he's so annoying, and they're just, like, determined to make everybody hate this character, he walks in and he said something like, well, I wanted to come up here as the self-proclaimed morale officer, and rather than say, I told you so, and I went, oh my God, please beam him off the bridge.
Well, as Kim said, Neelix has decided he's the morale officer. He seems to even strangely try to make amends with Janeway, convincing her to try one of the stuffed cardaway leaves. He then suggests they sing a song, to which Janeway replies, don't push it, Neelix.
Don't push it.
Nice. I do think they were trying to show that Neelix, in his own way, trying to make amends.
Except with coming in saying, I told you so.
Okay, that kind of ruined it.
Mm-hmm.
Things start looking up as they've arrived at the wound, and Janeway orders B'Elanna to begin the nucleonic beam. But it's not really helping. The Doctor calls as he's had an idea that they can use Voyager as a suture to help the creature heal. Janeway realizes they need to create a diversion to distract it, and Harry fires off a microprobe, which attracts all the lightning away from Voyager. With only seconds, Tom manages to maneuver Voyager into the breach. Once in, Janeway orders B'Elanna to deploy the nucleonic beam again, fore and aft. And we get some more interesting VFX. Well, the walls are closing in, and Janeway orders to hold position until the last second before they break free. Chakotay reports the life form is closing the wound as they leave the pink cloud, and they're out. Janeway is back to recording a log, and instead of supplementing their energy reserves, they manage to deplete them by 20%.
Oh my God.
Fail.
Failure.
In the turbo lift, Janeway runs into Harry, who invites her to Tom's holo program. And we see in the holodeck there are now other crew members there. And the holo pool shark starts trying to talk to B'Elanna, giving his advice on women. Which is great, because she asks Tom, "Did you program this guy?" Tom says, "Yeah, why?" And B'Elanna just says, "He's a pig, and so are you." Tom looks so crestfallen here.
He's like, what?
Janeway now puts on a bit of a show, pretending that she doesn't really understand this game of pool.
Oh, yeah.
And then proceeds to wipe the floor with Tom, who looks very surprised.
Yeah, she's a pool shark. And the holo character is like, I saw that coming. That was funny.
Yes.
Why is this the place we've ended up? This is ridiculous. Why can we not create a different holosuite program where everyone can hang out?
And not be harassed by holo programs?
Well, only the women are being harassed.
Well, that would seem to work for Tom.
Mm-hmm. Anyway.
The end.
Well, overanalysis?
Okay, let's get into it. I think this is another example, and I've whined about it before, where they're putting modern values onto more evolved humans and a better society. They're treating Starfleet as, well, it's the Navy in space. Almost, I feel like, it's the Navy from a century ago in space. Why do the captains need to be distant? Couldn't we have evolved humans having a more evolved command and leadership structure? Knowing your crew isn't a weakness, it's a requirement.
Yeah.
I feel if there's a move to be more than just a military force, why would you simply replicate old structures?
At the end of the day, it's still the 90s.
True, yeah.
We've talked about that before. It's like when we were watching Space Seed, the episode that was the basis for The Wrath of Khan.
Right.
And we talked about the writers had been born before the turn of the century. Or no, I don't think that's quite right. I think what we found was it was very early in the 20th century. So like 1915 or 16 was one of them, and another one was around 1920. I mean, whatever the specific number was, it's about 100 years ago at this point. You kind of have to expect some of the things that happen, right, based on that. But we showed a lot of stuff in this episode that just felt out of place and out of time. And that's one of them.
Yeah. Next thing. So, despite being on the ship for weeks, did Neelix have no idea what Starfleet and these people were like? He was studying up on tricorders and wanted to go on an away mission, was learning away mission protocols, and then suddenly he doesn't seem to know anything about what Starfleet is about?
Neelix is a mess.
I think if you bring someone on board, you should really brief them about what you actually do.
Yeah. Make them watch. Like, I bring this up all the time, but like in the first episode of The Next Generation where they made Riker sit down and watch the part of the episode he'd missed.
Oh, yeah.
They should have made Neelix sit down and watch TNG.
Oh, right.
Could you just sit here, go through all 7 seasons of that, and then you'll understand?
Yeah, Picard got one of the ensigns to get the VHS of episode 1 and started playing it.
Neelix he's like chaos, and I don't understand why Janeway would tolerate it.
Yeah.
That's why I really like the scene where she just told him to shut up and get out. It's like, that's what she needs to do. If you want to be a captain, that's what you need to do. You need to take control of the situation because he's the one causing cracks.
Yeah.
And you have to put a stop to it.
Next thing, I think we mentioned this, that Neelix was making a good point with Janeway about setting an example because of the resistance to eating the different foods.
We did.
The problem was that was a private conversation. And I get the feeling that the food Neelix is cooking isn't necessarily bad. It's just not what they're used to.
Yeah.
And I feel that maybe that is something that needs to come down from the captain of, no, this isn't your waffle and eggs that you like in the mornings. This is something different. So it strikes me as the crew being a little bit inflexible. They're used to having certain nice things.
Yeah. And this is just another bad thing on a bunch of bad things.
This is why they needed a counselor.
It would definitely be the right thing for Janeway to say, hey, look, we're not sure how long this is going to take for us to get home, but, I promise you we're going to get there. But we need to be cautious in how we're expending our resources.
Yeah.
Of course, then she goes and makes a bunch of crazy decisions that cost them or deplete their resources by 20%. But I think she should tell the crew that and just say, here's one way that we can all do this, and just show that she's also doing it. I do think that's all legit and something she should do as a leader. I just question not only that we had this conversation sort of publicly, you should never humiliate other people in front of others. You just shouldn't do that.
Right.
what didn't work for me is that speech came from Neelix. Because what has he shown that he would have this level of maturity to even believe that? I would have believed that came from Kes. But this character of Neelix is a mess.
Okay, let's talk about that now. Absolutely 100% agree. I don't think they quite know what they're doing with Neelix, so they're thrashing around.
Yeah.
Next thing, onto the topic of missing home. From Harry's comment in the holodeck, I've been thinking about this. Starfleet is all about exploring, and being on ships for a long period of time. Their training must cover this. They've only been out here a few weeks, so would the stresses of being decades away from home really be hitting them now, this early? Perhaps I could see this with the Marquis crew, who, if they've been in the Badlands near where their colonies are, they've never been that far from home. But Starfleet, isn't this your training? The original Enterprise, they went on 5-year missions.
Yes, but we weren't on a 5-year mission. We were on a short mission where everybody probably thought they'd be home by now. And now we're saying, oh, well, maybe 70 years.
Yeah.
So I do think it would cause some consternation. And then on top of that is the whole thing with the Maquis getting mixed into their crew.
Yeah.
So I can see where there would be some cracks, even this early.
Yeah. I guess if they're set for the mindset of we're away for 2 weeks or a month, and it suddenly becomes 70 years, guys.
70 years.
That would get a little stressful.
I think so. And also there's this annoying Neelix on board. And I can't order my usual stuff, my comfort food.
Captain, we've discovered the source of the poor morale. It's Neelix. It makes me think of a story I listened to from a veteran saying about his service on an aircraft carrier in the 1960s, saying that the first few months when the food was at its best, time just flew by. It was great. And by the end of the tour, every day was a week long. And that was only 6 months, I think.
Yeah.
Plus a plug for the Midway Museum in San Diego. People should visit that. And my final point, I thought it was really interesting that the Doctor was encouraging B'Elanna to come up with the treatment plan for the creature. It's that indication that maybe his program is evolving beyond that basic medical supplement. And I like the first nods towards that.
Yeah, that was definitely interesting.
Even if he is terribly sarcastic and rude.
Yes.
And that's it for me. Over to you, Cam.
Well, was this bad captaining?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say no, because the needs of the ship to get additional energy reserves were pretty high, and this seemed like a standard nebula, and they were relying on their sensors and what they knew. So I wouldn't even describe it as a calculated risk, because they thought they were doing something they knew, and they ended up in the unknown.
But when they hit that energy barrier, they could have sent out a probe, a shuttle. We just punched through, and then the hole closed behind us. I wasn't convinced that was a great idea.
I think she was keeping her eye on the prize versus caution. So I don't necessarily think it's bad captaining. I think it just came down to it didn't work out.
She's just so not cautious.
Yeah.
It just seems sometimes like she's too cavalier about things at this point. And speaking of the captain, I don't understand why she allows Neelix and Kes on the bridge. I don't think it makes sense. She seems like she, especially in crunch time, which that was when they were going back into the nebula or the non-nebula. I just thought it was weird that she let them on the bridge. I don't think she really would have.
Interesting. I don't have a good answer for that other than the writers wanted to.
We have these characters. They should be on the bridge.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about women in the future.
Okay.
In general, this isn't a particularly awful episode for women in the future, but the holosuite stuff is obviously not great. It's not great for Star Trek in general, I don't think, what goes on there. And while I appreciate that it wasn't on the bridge or it wasn't something that people were being subjected to against their will or while they were on duty, so it was making their workplace uncomfortable, it's just not a great look for Star Trek. And I don't think we would do the same thing now as we did in the 90s. Yeah. So even though we have all these women on the show, we're trying to build women characters, trying to show more, we still are sort of doing this weird stuff that is just uncomfortable. The difference, though, I would say, between Deep Space Nine and this show is not only that the women characters are being developed a little bit differently because they're not spending all their time in the first few seasons talking about boys, which I complained about a lot on that show. But when B'Elanna calls that pool shark guy a pig and calls Tom a pig, right? In Deep Space Nine, what would have happened is that one of the women characters would have told the other women characters why it was okay.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Dax would have told Kira why it wasn't a big deal and why you had to allow Quark to do whatever crap he was doing or whatever. That was the real nightmare to me. It's like when somebody is harassed and somebody else just says, oh, can't you take a joke?
Yeah, right.
And they really wanted those women characters to take a joke. And that was offensive. And here we did something different. So I'm trying to give really specific reasons why I will give this show credit, because I think there is a really specific reason why this is slightly different. I'm not saying it was great, but they at least addressed it.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
And then if I move to Janeway's leadership corner, we've talked quite a bit about leadership already, as we seem to do a lot, way more even on this podcast than we ever did on Deep Space Nine, except in very specific situations.
What was it one of our listeners said?
It's a management podcast disguising itself as a Star Trek podcast. She's not wrong. Finding a balance between distance as a leader and bonding, it's very tricky. I believe that if somebody sees you as being in control and in command, that can be really important in crunch time. It can give people confidence. It can give them belief in their jobs. It can give them hope for the future. So I do think all those things are good. But I also prefer to work with groups of people when we see each other as humans and we build friendship bonds. And I'm not saying that we become best friends outside of work, but friendship bonds at work in a way that helps us to believe in each other, trust each other, have a laugh together, work hard for each other, support each other when we need to. I do think that is really important. It doesn't necessarily align with that old school accepted technique from the 90s, but I think it's a better way to lead.
Well, I think, again, why is an evolved society the Navy and space? It's almost like the old British Army joke from the officers of, you don't talk to the men.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe the other thing or the last thing I would say about leadership is that Janeway she seems a bit cavalier. And I'm glad that she is very confident in her decisions and she makes decisions quickly. I think that's good. But quick decisions can get them into big trouble. And maybe she'll realize something from this, although this is an episodic show. So do we learn from episode to episode? I don't know. But she ought to learn from this that she jumped at the chance to try to get something so she could get her coffee. I mean, that was a little part of it. But she jumped at that chance and ended up depleting their reserves by 20%. And that's critical when you got to survive for 70 years on your own.
I'm going to say yes, because the character does evolve across the show.
Okay, well, that remains to be seen. I don't remember that much detail. I mean, yet again, I didn't remember how this episode ended, but I did remember as we started to watch, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. We lose a lot in this episode and we don't get anything out of it. So that's what I have to say about Leadership Corner. So let's move on to rating. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or neutral. What is your rating?
Absolute thumbs down. What the hell were they doing with Neelix? I feel this episode is... It's odd. It feels like it should have been an earlier script and it got stuck in here.
Right.
I feel we've had too much development at this point to suddenly jump in with the way Neelix is behaving, the sort of the Tom thing, the interaction between Harry and Tuvok. It feels like this should have been episode 2.
Yeah, I could see that this would be episode 2. Mm-hmm.
But despite a few good lines, this is a thumbs down.
I agree. This is a thumbs down. The first thumbs down for me anyway. And well, really the first thumbs down for both of us in the season. It's not a great episode.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sad because there are 2 iconic lines in the episode from Janeway, right? There's coffee in that nebula, but I wouldn't recommend anybody to watch this episode just to see that line. And then she's also got the dismissed. That's Starfleet speak for get out.
Yeah.
There's 2 really great, absolute iconic moments, but the rest of the episode is a total bust. Right. I completely agree.
I think this falls under the first filler.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, after one failed attempt and a very long recording, that wraps up Season 1, Episode 6. So come back next week for Episode 7. In the meantime, if you'd like to send us your own over-analysis of this or any episode, or if you just want to say something nice, you can email us at ReBingeIT@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram, Threads, the thing that used to be called Twitter, and YouTube, all at ReBingeIT. You can join us on the Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Star Trek TTM podcasts.
Thanks for joining us on the ReBinge Star Trek Voyager podcast.
That's it for me.
And that's it from me.